All right, folks, we're going to go ahead and get started. Okay, so we're going to move on to item number 4, which is a discussion about the draft fund expenditure policy. Again, there will be public comments at the end of this one. So if you, throughout the discussion that we're having at the advisory group, if you want to speak, can you please go ahead and fill out one of those comment cards? It helps us to gauge how much time we need for public comments during this this particular session. So a few things I also wanted to let you know in advance is that the PowerPoint presentations are going to be made available. We'll be posting them online, and the where they will be posted will be finished by the end of the week. We have a website that we've been working on, and we will have it up by Friday, and we'll send a notice out to the email subscription list for the Safer Drinking Water Program so that you can locate that. But we will have all of the meeting materials posted there for you. So I'll turn it over to Joe. You gotta test. Oh, there you go.
Okay. Okay, thanks, Jessica. I always love speaking after lunch because usually people are quiet for at least the first half hour. So let's see how far I can get. All right, so what I thought I'd do is provide a little context, some program updates. And we talked about some of this during our previous discussion, but I'll go back over it. So I'll skip that one. Andrew went over that, which we all know is kind of hard to read on the screen anyway. So this next slide is our anticipated expenditures for this fiscal year. So just as a reminder, in terms of the timing, the budget was actually passed before SB 200, and we were provided $130 million for fiscal year 19-20 to get things kickstarted. So the funding, although we need to use consistent with SB 200, some of the rules don't apply. Like, we don't have to spend the money consistent with the fund expenditure plan because, we don't have one yet. So what we did was we looked at a number of projects that we currently have in the hopper, and this money needs to be encumbered. And for those of you who don't know some of our terminology, it means we have to actually have it in an agreement, in a funding agreement. So we have to have a funding agreement that's executed or going to be executed real soon. And the way all the timing works, essentially by May. So we're really looking at what could we do really very quickly. So we have a number of projects that are in process. And we looked at switching the funding source. So that those first two items are where these are projects that we're going to get funded, either planning or construction projects. And we're switching out the funding source. A lot of times it's proposition money or principal forgiveness. So the good thing about that is then we'll be able to use those funds for other capital projects for small disadvantaged communities. Then we also have interim replacement water as well. So we've got a couple of our technical assistance providers, some of the nonprofits that have been helping with interim replacement water like bottled water, and we're working with them to enhance their programs that they have. And so that's about $8.4 million. So a couple of them, and I might be missing a few, but just to give you an idea, we have one project that's bottled water for schools. So any schools that are receiving water from a public water system or their own water system, we'd be providing students and staff with bottled water, or it could also be point of use if that would work. And then we're working with self-help. So Jesse had mentioned that earlier. And for their service area, so there are 8 counties having an interim replacement water program that could be used for residents of public water systems or small water systems or on domestic wells. And then we also have an agreement we're working on with the Community Water Center in the Central Coast that they'll focus on domestic wells. Then we also have some existing technical assistance, and those of you who are technical assistance providers under Proposition 1 know that one of the restrictions and challenges was the technical assistance had to have a nexus to a project. And so one of the things we're doing is, so these are existing agreements that are in place. We're switching out some of the remaining funding that's available to use the funds from this allocation, and then that'll provide us a lot more flexibility in terms of what kind of technical assistance those providers can offer. And that's something that we can do relatively quickly. So the other thing we're working on is we're working with several of the existing technical assistance providers on new technical assistance agreements. There are a few that a couple of providers we still need to talk to. A number had approached us with thoughts and ideas on how they could help us with the implementation of the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund. So we've set aside $40 million for that, and so we're actively working on developing those funding agreements. And then we basically kept some funds kind of in reserve just in case something comes up in the next month or two that we hadn't thought of. We want to make sure we had some funding available for that. And if we don't come up with something, we'll more than likely enhance our technical assistance agreements. Okay, and then the other thing I wanted to touch on is, and I think this was mentioned earlier, the overall SAFER program encompasses more than this funding that we just received. So I do want to remind folks that we have provided a lot of funding and are providing a lot of funding. So this is just to give you a little bit of an idea of what we've done so far in this fiscal year. So with our technical assistance work plans and the way those work, and this is where we have, I think, had a success in terms of being efficient, is so rather than having separate agreements for every single project a TA provider does, we have one large agreement with them, then they submit a work plan to us for a given project, and then we review and approve that work plan. So there have been 35 new ones associated with drinking water. We've had about 41 that are amended. And those amendments, a lot of times, of course, the TA provider goes in to look at a system, and they identify some other things that need to be done that maybe weren't initially identified, or they run into stumbling blocks, and it takes a little longer than they thought. Another new program, this came from general fund allocation from the legislature, was lead testing and remediation in childcare centers. So we have one funding agreement to address that. For our drinking water planning projects for small disadvantaged communities, so far we've completed 7 agreements, and then had 22 amendments. And this, part of this is to kind of show you what our workload is as well. And, one of the challenges is when we get a lot of amendments, so when things aren't going as people predict, that's the same people that write the new agreements and work on the new agreements are the same ones that have to review the request to change an old one, right? So then with construction projects, we've had 18 new agreements executed, 9 amended, and then interim replacement water, we've had 8 approved agreements and then 17 executed. So our process with interim replacement waters, we'll get a request, it gets approved, then we work on the actual funding agreement. So, and I'll be kind of touching on this, I'm sure, a few times, but just in terms of looking at opportunities for efficiency, we saw that we're getting a whole lot of these amendments, and so we're streamlining our internal processes so it doesn't take quite as long to process a simple amendment like extending the time or approving the details of an already approved overall project budget. And then, as I mentioned, with some of the providers providing interim replacement water, like self-help, I have no idea how many interim replacement water projects we have with you guys. I'm sure it's in the 20s or 30s or more. So we said, why don't we just do one, cover everything, and then it'll be similar to a technical assistance agreement. We'll say, hey, here's a need in this community. This is what we want to do. Do you guys approve it? So we have that set up, so we're not spending as much time on the administration part. The other program I didn't mention is drinking water for schools. We actually execute a lot of agreements, so we can do a lot of these when they're relatively simple. So we've done 73 of those, and that was from a new program the legislature provided some funding for. But moving forward, again, we're going to look to a couple of providers to administer this grant program for the next allocation we got. So the initial program was both access related, so putting in new fountains so kids would actually drink water instead of soda or other alternatives, and then also dealing with water quality impairment problems. One of the things I think Andrew had touched on earlier is, and you heard from the discussion of the needs analysis and the timing of that. So if you recall, we're not getting the results from the needs analysis, the final reports, until spring of next year. So we won't have that information for our fund expenditure plan for this year. So what we thought we should do is kind of do a quick triage of all the systems that are on the human right to water list. So not wait for the kind of detailed assessment that will be done on those systems. So that's what we've been doing over the last couple of months, is the Division of Financial Assistance, the Division of Drinking Water, the local primacy agency. We've been meeting, going over each of those systems, and basically we're putting them into two categories. Are they A, on schedule, or B, need some help or additional encouragement? And so if they're on schedule, that could be, on schedule can mean it's going to take a long time, because they might be early in the planning process, but there's nothing else to do at this moment except go through that planning process, do the feasibility study, the engineering report, that sort of thing. And also, Division of Drinking Water, the district engineers will often know that if we're not providing funding, but they may know that the system is self-funding, or in some cases there's ongoing litigation with a responsible party that will address the problem. So we're doing that kind of quick assessment. And if there is, and basically you look at this, we identified a number of systems that we felt were on schedule. Of the 253 we've reviewed so far, and this is going for each district. This is why it's taking a little while. So we have a couple-hour conversation with each district engineer. So we still have a few more discussions left. So there are about 111 out of the 253 that need some additional action. In some cases, that might be, we'll talk to our technical assistance providers and ask them to help the system out. It may be that there's an enhanced enforcement that needs to be done. So the district engineer has identified that the system isn't very responsive, so we need to write an enforcement order to that system. And in other cases, the next action may be take a while, a longer time to actually implement, like, for example, appointing an administrator. So if the system is failing, they're just not capable of taking that next step, we have that administrator authority, but we both have to appoint an administrator, which is a Division of Drinking Water function, and fund that administrator. And then, we had some good news. Out of the 253 we looked at, we actually realized 6 of them had already returned to compliance. So we had some early good news and victory. So we still have about 57 systems remaining to do this initial assessment. I don't think it here. While I was talking, I wasn't showing you guys this, was I? I saw it on my screen. Okay. So again, total number of systems on the list, then the number of systems that we had jointly assessed was about 253. About 136 are on schedule, 111 need some other action, and then the number that are returned to compliance. So basically, when we've had these discussions so far, we've been able to, identify some next steps. You want me to take questions now as I go? Okay. I don't know where's the other mic?
Working? Okay, it is working. Michael Claiborne, a quick question. Well, a couple of quick questions. This list is really helpful, but wondering how much information about these kind of internal assessments you can share out, about the individual assessments.
Yeah, that's something we're talking about now because we want to be able to give the UCLA team some of that information, and there's some that will probably end up being more deliberative, where we can't say for the specific system because, like they don't know that they're on this list of getting potentially getting an administrator or a consolidation order, versus when we're talking about funding and potentially providing technical assistance, I wouldn't worry quite as much about providing that information. So we'll talk about what we feel comfortable providing. Otherwise, we may just end up at the very least summarizing, like for those systems that have some identified next step, what are we planning to do?
Okay, that was kind of my next question which is of these 111 systems, are there kind of trends that you've noticed that this is why these systems aren't quite on schedule?
They're usually small. Yeah. So I'd say that's a definite trend for sure. But other than that, I mean, a lot of these are kind of snowflakes, right? As soon as you start getting into the details about what's going on, there's some specific reason or story of what's happening. And, and again, sometimes there's something we at the State Water Board need to do and haven't done. And sometimes it's, that the system is just not very responsive. And, I think in those cases, we'll be looking closely at, do they need an administrator appointed? But we also run into some challenges in terms of, some of these systems are non-DAC systems, but they're small. And they don't necessarily have the funding to address the problem, and they're not necessarily close to any other system, so they're not a great candidate for consolidation. So I think we're going to end up with, some subset of these where, the answer just really isn't clear.
And
we're going to share a lot of that. I mean, we're working on internally how to share and track all of this and the level of detail of what we share. But certainly this kind of analysis is the kind of thing that we want to be going over with this group and more publicly, making it more publicly available.
And one other quick question, the 6 systems that were returned to compliance, are any of those systems Hexchrome?
No.
Okay.
No, these were all, these were more systems where, the information for return to compliance has to show up in DDW's database, their SIDWIS database, where they track that. And sometimes it just hadn't been entered, or, they're waiting for a certain number of sample results to get back to say, yeah, we think they're below the MCL consistently now.
Joe, I just wanted to try to clarify I understood this correctly. Is when you first started speaking about the funding expenditure plan for 1920 for the 130, you put the breakdown and the different project types and the amounts, and
yeah,
I think you gave a deadline for the commitment for the 55 million, and you said those, you were trying to put that funding on the projects that were kind of shovel ready that you could get through execution by May? Did you say?
Yeah, it's not even shovel ready. It's like, is it in our shop being processed right now?
But
So it's basically just a matter of, like, originally a project maybe was getting bond funding and principal forgiveness. So now we're not changing the scope or anything like that. We're just saying, okay, the funding will come from
you're
this
you're
appropriation.
Okay, you're just moving the funding, but
Yes.
it sounds like if you get to a funding agreement, doesn't it typically mean that your project, you've pretty much got it through design and environmental?
Yeah.
So it is,
Yeah.
in a way, projects that are in the queue that are shovel ready that if
Oh,
they've-
sure.
they've
Yeah.
received,
These are projects that they were going to get
they
funded
were going to
anyway.
get funding from some other pot.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
They were going to get funded from another pot. By doing this, we then, of course, free up those other
Okay.
funds,
Okay.
which are generally for capital projects to be used for a future capital project.
And then on the category, the project type for new technical assistance,
Yes,
the 40 million,
yes.
does technical assistance, can that also be can that be given to a public agency?
Yeah, yep, sure.
And is there a deadline for when does I guess my question is, what's the mechanism to apply for that 40 million?
Yeah, we're not doing a solicitation. We've been going to our existing TA providers, but if there's a public agency that wants to do technical assistance on, like, if you guys want to provide some technical assistance to small systems in your area, then yeah, you talk to us. Not sure we can do it this fiscal year, but we should start having those discussions. So a lot of that, and the reason that's a fairly big number is we're looking at, there are a couple of TA providers that are going to get some engineering firms or environmental service firms that they'll subcontract with, so that we can do a lot of the planning through those TA agreements. I had mentioned that earlier. So hopefully accelerating that process.
So I think that's where I was going with the
Mhm.
question, was that I was trying to understand the difference between the planning
Right.
and the technical assistance that I think I heard you say can be used for planning.
Right.
And so I'm just going to use CVWD as an example.
Mhm.
If we have identified 40 projects to consolidate 83 systems,
Right.
we obviously need a lot of planning money for
Right.
that.
Right.
And my question is, can that come through the means of technical assistance, or does it have to be planning?
Well, we should probably talk about that offline.
Okay.
Yeah.
So-
I don't want to take up the group's
Sure.
time in terms of
Okay.
those details.
I'm just
but
trying to figure out what that means, but
Yeah.
I think you've answered it. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, Andrew, Isabel.
Oh, and just a reminder, if you could just say your name when you ask your question.
Isabel Solorio del ENER. Lo mío es nada más, es como una sugerencia. Asegurar que siempre estén hablando con la comunidad, por ejemplo, en temas de consolidar, temas legales, ingeniería y administración. Al final los residentes conocen mejor su comunidad, y eso me refiero a todas las comunidades no incorporadas, no nomás a mi comunidad. Al final nosotros sabemos qué nos funciona en nuestra comunidad y qué no nos funciona y qué nos afecta. Si, por ejemplo, hay un corto de luz, nosotros somos los afectados en que no tenemos agua. Y eso sucedía en nuestra comunidad porque no teníamos un generador que operara en los momentos que la luz se iba. Entonces, hay gente incapacitada que no recibe esa agua. Los que podemos movernos tenemos el acceso a poder buscar una manera, pero esa gente anciana, incapacitada, no tiene ese acceso. So, es un considerar esos detalles porque al final los residentes conocen más sus problemas de sus mismas comunidades.
Isabel Solorio from Lanier has a recommendation, and she says to make sure that the state board is always communicating with communities on topics of consolidation, legal, or other general topics related to drinking water. And this is because community members know their communities best. And specifically unincorporated communities like Lanier, they know what works for them and they know what affects them. So if the power goes out, the community members are the first to know that there will be no water because they need to contact an operator. So for example, people with disabilities can get the help they need in case there's no water, there's no power. So they're the ones that know who to go to, what to do. And so to please consider these details when hashing out the plan.
Thank you.
So I have just two questions on the anticipated expenditures.
Mhm.
Excuse me. So the first is, we've talked a little bit, and I know we'll talk at further length about the administrator program, but I was wondering where that funding will be coming from, or if any of that will happen in fiscal year 2019-20. And then I have a second question, but I'll hold.
Okay. I'm not sure to what extent we'll be funding administrators this fiscal year, because I'm not aware of any orders that Division of Drinking Water has issued yet. So that's kind of the first step. Well, they have to designate the system, say they're going to appoint an administrator, and go through that kind of process. Now, I'm just laying out the expenditures from the 130 million we received. We've also received a whole bunch of other money from general fund allocations, including about $10 million to help fund administrators, and another 10 million for other urgent drinking water needs. So I haven't given you the whole laundry list of everything that we're funding related to the SAFER program overall. But certainly, as soon as those opportunities come up, we'll be working closely with Division of Drinking Water to make sure we have the funding available to meet those needs.
Okay, and so then my second question might fall into the same bucket, which is that there doesn't appear to be any accommodation for well communities. And I wondered if that's because there aren't well projects in the pipeline, or if it's because they're captured in a different way. But the focus on public water systems makes me a little nervous that we might be missing private wells.
Yeah, so I mentioned that there's one project with Community Water Center that we have going on in the Central Coast, which is to provide interim replacement water. We also have, outside of these expenditures, we have a household well program as well. So we're supplementing some of the existing agreements we have. So that can be repair or replacement of wells. So we do have some of those things going on. It's not all captured here. Here we had to be opportunistic. We had to, what can we get in place right away? And so we were looking for those opportunities.
So then as we move into a discussion of the fund going forward, will we be able to have information about all those other buckets as well so that we understand the funding context?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep,
Thank
definitely. You. Yeah, that's, we'll eventually get to talking about the policy and we'll discuss that. Yep.
We just wanted us to pick up Isabel's comments. In our experience is that we cannot come to talk to you about, hey, we got a really great project, without definitely even consulting with the community. So it goes the other way around. So we have spent a great deal of time, years planning with the community. So finally, when Proposition 1 came out, we told the community, okay, this is it. This is the opportunity we've been waiting for. So that's the reason why we have this planning project, which is involving engineering, preliminary engineering, and sequence, and all this stuff. So to get to the point that these projects are shovel ready, and the next step is just to submit the construction applications. So, but it's important to know that the communities need to definitely have a vested interest. They need to be the drivers of that because, as Isabel pointed out, people know better than anybody what are the priorities, what are the needs, what needs to be done. You know, not the other way around. That has been the conventional way historically that project has been prioritized by the government. And that's the reason why the majority of the time is not successful. I'm trying to figure out a way that we can actually have some metrics on these anticipated expenditures, so we can monitoring in reality how this allocation of these fundings are going to be deployed. So we know that in certain ways, as you say, Joe, there are some variables that cannot be controlled by the water boards because certain systems are really slow in responding and you're waiting for that. That's something that is beyond control, right? But in addition to that, what can we do to start actually analyzing where is the backlog is, or where, and you're not going to be specific here, where in the process, when we submit an application for planning and go through the whole, general, the technical, the environmental, the financials, the whole package, what can we do to analyze and to minimize the time of actually getting those approved so we can have those projects shovel ready? That's something that I would like to see eventually here, so we can say, hey, you know what, we are now have these numbers of projects and we are averaging this many months and approving the whole package. So we're trying to actually minimize, because sometimes in the ideal world, people talk about 9 months, but we know the reality is not like that.
Right.
It takes longer than that. So those are the kind of things that we need to definitely, in my opinion, start scrutinizing. Where can we improve? Where is the process can be accelerated so we can deploy those resources into these communities? Because the challenge is this. Remember what I told you, that we have been working with those communities for like 20 years. So we have to report back to them and say, they're still reviewing, and then 5 years passes and people start to get really discouraged. And we are the one also that is at stake in terms of credibility of the process.
Right. Yeah. So, and I'll definitely get to the other questions. Let me just finish up. I've got this slide and one more, and then we can capture the rest of the questions. But this goes from comment you made, Sergio. So one of the things we are doing is we're looking at how to streamline our agreement process, and certainly, those of you who have enjoyed it or suffered through it, are some of the best folks to provide us some feedback on where you think things can be improved, because a lot of times you also understand what some of the constraints are as well, right? Because you've learned it enough to know, okay, well, they just have to do this X, Y, Z. But certainly, we're looking really closely at, where do we need to kind of do the full-blown process, all of the different steps that we have, in order to, ensure that we have a solid funding agreement, confidence that, especially when we're doing loans, right? We need to ensure that, the loan's going to get repaid and that sort of thing. But there may be a different approach when, we're providing grants in terms of the level of scrutiny that we put a project through before getting to the funding agreement. Or the other thing is, the other thing we're thinking about is, in some cases we know, as an example, that the water rates aren't high enough. So, one approach is we wait until those rate increases have occurred before we actually, go into the process of executing a construction agreement. But there may be some things we can do to move those processes in parallel. So look at those opportunities to move things in parallel rather than sequential, which ends up taking up a lot of time. So, yeah. But we are doing we're starting to do what you suggested. I have from my previous job this painfully complex description of our processes. It actually is about 5 feet tall in my office. If you ever come visit, you can see it. So it's all the different steps that we have to take. And so one of the things that we've done is we've looked at that and said, well, where are we maybe duplicating effort? Where can we streamline or cut out, or where is it you just have to, we have to do these steps. Okay, and I'll get to the other questions in a second here. Just want to give everybody a heads up that we have a new pre-application. So this is also trying to hopefully get to funding projects a little more quickly. So instead of doing our normal full-blown kind of application for planning or construction, we have a pre-application small community funding program that's for both drinking water and wastewater. So we have our folks monitoring that. So we still have the other ways of applying for funding. Those are still there for those of you who are familiar with it. But using this approach, you just have a brief description of what your project and need is, and then we'll figure out which program you need to go through and contact you and help you through that application process. And so it can cover interim assistance, regular planning, construction, need an administrator, that sort of thing. We're trying to simplify it. So if you look at that and you have any feedback on that, we'd certainly appreciate your feedback. Okay. Okay, I'm being told I have to go through the rest. Yes, okay. All right. All right, so now we'll go through the policy. And just in terms of context, for those of you who have been working on this for a while, you'll remember there was Senate Bill 623, and it had a certain approach, which was the proposal was to have fees, right? Kind of per connection fee, and that's what would be used to fund this particular fund. So when that was being constructed or thought about, we thought, oh, well, we'll have a year to build up the program and figure out what we're going to do. So it was kind of unexpected to us to get all this money at once. So there's a certain aspect of this where we're not trying to, or what we're trying to do is leave room to grow and to adapt and change. So we're not putting a lot of detail in these initial iterations. It's kind of similar to the administrator handbook that the Division of Drinking Water established. So we're expecting it to change and be modified over time. So with that context, talk about the policy. So this is just kind of an outline. And I think, did everybody get, all the advisor group members, you got a copy of the policy, okay? So I'll go through this relatively quickly. I think what you'll see is most of the sections are, paraphrasing what statutory requirements are. So these are things that are in like SB 200 or they're associated with greenhouse gas reduction fund. So, we talk about the purpose, objective, the nexus to the human right to water and climate change. Some of the, and I'll touch on these a little further. This is just the outline. Some of the requirements that come with the greenhouse gas reduction fund. So the eligibility for funding, this is defined in statute. And it's broader than we normally have for our bonds. Yeah, and this says, so it's federal, one of the things we mentioned tribes, so it's both federally recognized and state recognized tribes, public agencies, nonprofits. We can fund administrators, and administrators can be individuals, they can be private entities, so that's fairly broad. Groundwater sustainability agencies as well. And let's see. We define some key terms and conditions, and the responsibility of Division of Drinking Water versus the Division of Financial Assistance. And actually, there's one slide that didn't make it on here, but it's an important one. So the eligibility for, kind of backing up a little bit. So SB 200, basically the way it's structured is we'll get a transfer primarily of greenhouse gas reduction funds each year, right? And then, so it's $130 million each year. Now, there are restrictions that come with that. So this year we have a mix. We have $100 million of greenhouse gas reduction fund and $30 million of general fund. So for the greenhouse gas reduction funds, there has to be a nexus to facilitating reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in California communities. So that's one, okay? Or improve climate change resiliency and adaptation for disadvantaged communities, low-income communities, or low-income households. So that second one's a little easier. We think will be easier for us to do as we're identifying projects, being able to make the argument that it's increasing climate change resiliency and adaptation. But when we're looking at potentially funding non-DAC communities, being able to have that nexus for each project with facilitating reductions in greenhouse gas emissions might be a little more challenging. So that's kind of something to keep in mind. We have both the requirements within Senate Bill 200 that apply, and then wherever we're getting our funding from, which now is most primarily through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, we have those requirements that apply as well. Okay. So let's see. All right, so I'll go into a little more detail on the kind of the outline of the fund expenditure plan in a few slides. There's also defined, I'm not sure why it showed up in this policy, but it's there. We have to define the process for petitioning the state board for consideration of consolidation. So this is where, a member of a disadvantaged community can petition us and ask the Division of Drinking Water to issue a consolidation order. And we also will discuss some of the resources available through the broader program. We touch on the advisory group, and I think we mentioned this before, so we're here now. And then, and I'll show you with some of the timelines for the policy and the fund expenditure plan, where we're thinking we would have meetings of this group and kind of how it fits into the overall development of those plans and policies. Okay, and I think we heard quite a bit about the drinking water needs analysis, so I'll skip over that. But again, all of this is connected, right? This needs analysis, it serves as one of the foundational pieces of information for us to identify what are the solutions that water systems need. And so we're, we'll be looking at those systems that are public water systems, so that's the PWS, in violation of primary drinking water standards, those that are at risk per the needs assessment. We'll look at the contaminated aquifer risk map that was referred to, the drought risk map. I know there are questions about outreach regarding and testing domestic wells, so that's part of the potential solutions. And also, and we'll be reviewing the well data for small water systems and individual wells where we have that. And also looking at those water systems serving disadvantaged communities that charge rates above an affordability threshold that has not been established. So in terms of prioritizing, so I would say this is the main substance of what we put in this policy for now, where we're actually proposing some policy direction. For those systems that are in violation, we're looking at prioritizing based on immediate health risk, where there's maybe untreated or at-risk sources, or other chronic compliance or water shortage problems. And then we've also identified potential solutions. So essentially the suite of solutions is similar for both the systems in violation and those at risk. including the interim water supplies, administrators, help with planning, regionalization, consolidation, infrastructure repair, replacement, and upgrade, optimizing the system, the long-term O&M. And so I want to touch on this briefly, just because we've been asked a number of questions about O&M, and I think at least now the way we're looking at it is that we want to make sure that a system is operating efficiently and optimally before we even consider supporting their operation and maintenance costs, because this funding is not lasting forever. So I think funding support of O&M as kind of a bridge to a more sustainable future makes a lot of sense, but supporting O&M that is going to need to be indefinite, I think would be a real challenge with considering a funding program that has a shelf life. So that's something that I'm sure that as we talk about it further, you'll want to discuss. But now, certainly being one of the larger challenges that we collectively have to face is to what extent and how do we support operation and maintenance costs. And then the last potential solution is removing financial barriers to provide access to capital. So there may be some cases where a system has, let's say a large loan that they have out from years past that maybe is at unfavorable rates, and it's preventing them to get access to further loans or capital. So there's potential for us to help with that as well. Okay, so the next slide for the systems at risk, again, the prioritization is prioritizing the systems with source water contaminants where there's a new or revised MCL proposed. There might be inadequate technical, managerial, or financial capacity, history of violations, secondary risks. For example, they're not meeting waterworks standards, or maybe there's some of their infrastructure like a storage tank is failing or at risk of failing, or other potential risk factors. And so again, the solutions are going to be the same suite of solutions that we have for systems in violation. And then I know there's a question about metrics, and certainly I think we'll want to have both sort of those output and outcome metrics, like the output ones, how quickly are we getting funding agreements through the process, that sort of thing, but also obviously outcome based, how quickly are we getting systems back to compliance or to sustainability. At least initially, our metrics are looking at the number of communities and schools that are getting interim supplies of drinking water to address that immediate health risk. The communities and schools that have either executed or we've provided some preliminary planning assistance, like through our technical assistance providers. And then the schools or communities with long-term solutions. And so when we're looking at long-term solutions, we're going to be looking at it in a couple of different ways. One is on the regulatory side. Do we have an executed consolidation agreement or consolidation order? Has the funding agreement for construction been executed? Has the water system returned to compliance? So we're thinking of looking at that in a number of different ways. Okay, and then within the policy, we also mentioned the safe and affordable drinking water fund solution list. I think that's actually our SAFER list. So it includes not just the funding provided through SB 200, but also our state revolving fund, the principal forgiveness, our bonds, the general fund allocations we get as well. And we also, what's also mentioned in the policy is we need to report on the prior year expenditures. We have to have at least one public hearing for the fund expenditure plan, and then we report to the legislature annually as well. Okay, and then just kind of quickly, hopefully this is readable, is the timeline For the policy, again, this is officially called the policy for developing the fund expenditure plan. We released the draft in January. Comments are due by February 3rd, and then we're looking to go to our board March 3rd. And we do plan to have in February, before our board adoption, another meeting with you all. Okay, want me to keep cranking away? There's just a few more, just 2 more slides. Okay, so, we kind of touched on the purpose of the fund expenditure plan. So it's identifying those systems that are at risk or failing. It's figuring out what the needs are, what we're going to fund, and then trying to identify any gaps. And to the extent we can, the sources of funding to eliminate those gaps. And then the last thing is the timeline for the fund expenditure plan. So one of the things you'll notice is we need to start thinking about and drafting the fund expenditure plan before our board has actually acted on the policy. So we're going to kind of do our best and be flexible if the board goes in a different direction than we've proposed. So in February, when we meet with you all, we'll provide you an outline of that fund expenditure plan. We'll work on developing the plan in February and March, release the draft in early April, and then mid-April, talk to you all, the advisory group, about it. Comment period will end in early May, and then mid-June, board adoption. So we have to adopt this plan by June 30th. And that's our very last board meeting of the year. So hopefully they don't cancel that one. But okay.
Test. Okay, there we go. So I'm sure there's lots of questions, and I'm not certain what order they were in, but I think we're going to start with Horacio and then go to Lucy.
Did you had questions from before? The earlier part? Oh, awesome.
All right. And again, if you could just say your name so that folks in the audience.
Horacio from San Gerardo. So these projects that you already have, what period does it cover? 19, when does it start? What's the period of 19 and 20?
Oh, so that's the funding year. So it's in the current state year's budget. It's the money we got this fiscal year. So the fiscal year started July 1st. It ends June 30th of 2020. And so we have to get the money into a funding agreement this fiscal year, and the money has to be spent within 2 years after that. So we're also looking for projects that would be completed essentially by like February, March 2022. So that was the other criteria.
Are these projects public and private?
What do you mean? Like funding public entities and private entities?
Yes.
So yes, they would be. Yeah.
So they're a mixture of tax and non-tax?
No, they're all DAC projects. Yeah.
They're all located within all the counties of California, or just?
Oh, not all the counties. No, but they're located throughout the state. We have pretty good. I mean, there is, one of the projects is bottled water, statewide bottled water program. So I guess that one could potentially touch every county, but I don't think every county has water systems that are in violation of the MCLs.
There is some systems that require collateral, like you have to have collateral in order to obtain a water system. Is there any chance that the State Water Board can serve as a collateral so disadvantaged communities don't have to put the money in a reserve and pay interest?
Yeah, I'm not sure what you're referring to.
Okay,
So I understand with a loan, yeah, if a system is getting a loan, then they have to have the revenue coming in to pay that loan. But what we're talking about, at least with this first year's funding, is we're just providing grants.
yeah, but in our community, we, they're requesting $550,000 to have it in a reserve in order to obtain a water system. And the community is going to be paying interest on that money, and that's not a good thing for the human right to water, to increase the expenses when the state can be the collateral.
Yeah, I'll have to probably follow up with you because I'm not sure what that situation would be.
So, so the project list that you have already, you still have an extensive list that is going to be for the following year?
Well, right, the following year is going to depend on what the State Water Board adopts for the fund expenditure plan. So we have a lot of projects that are in the queue for capital projects and planning and that sort of thing. So those, we'll look to the funding sources that we normally do, which are the state bonds and our capitalization grant we get from the US EPA. So that's used as well. And to the extent that the State Water Board in the fund expenditure plan directs us to spend some of the SB 200 funding for those kind of capital projects, we would use that too. But otherwise, what I anticipate is the fund expenditure plan will direct us, to what kind of projects that we fund. And then we may have to do solicitations, or we may already have projects that have been submitted to us.
Are we going to be able to see the list of the projects that you're putting in for this year?
For this year?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. As soon as we don't have all of those agreements in place, but yeah, as soon as they're in place, we can provide you with a list.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
So just following up on your question, Horacio, in this policy document, is there an opportunity to, and this may be something to provide comments on, but to get to the issue of, like I'm looking on page 14 around safe and affordable drinking water fund solutions, that there is that systems may need to raise their rates in order to get funding. And so I think some of the issues that you brought up, Horacio, about what types of requirements and expectations there are on systems in order to be able to get funding agreements, or what requirements, it may be that not all of that detail is going to go into the fund expenditure plan policy, but there's a little bit here, and I just wonder where there's an opportunity for fleshing out more of those details around the types of conditions or expectations we would have for systems.
Okay. You weren't asking me a question, were you?
Well, I think I was just trying to follow. I think
Okay.
that's somewhat what he was asking.
Okay,
So
like what some of the other requirements might be. Yeah.
Yeah, and also like instead of having a community put in $550,000 on a reserve and pay interest, why not the state be the collateral so the community doesn't pay interest and make the drinking water more affordable for everybody?
Yeah, so I'm not sure exactly what that situation is you're referring to, but if you're saying the state would be sort of the backstop in case a system failed, or like say if they didn't have adequate reserves and something came up and um, and then you're suggesting that the state be there as the backstop to help address that particular issue. I think that's something we'd want to talk about in terms of when we're talking about sustainability. What does sustainability mean? It's probably along, technical, managerial, and financial. And for financial, a system does need to have adequate reserves. Get to the point where they have adequate reserves so that they can address, just sort of the normal operation and maintenance and kind of the normal replacement of capital as projects as well. So I think that's going to be a bigger discussion that we'll have, like what's the role of the state in supporting struggling systems versus like getting them from where they are now to being sustainable on their own over the longer term.
Just from a process standpoint, so those conversations about those issues, is that in this, that level of detail isn't in this document yet? Is it something that over time may be incorporated into this document, or is there other process in which we can hear feedback from community on that topic?
Yeah, so I think it's going to be, I think that's one of those issues that it will evolve. Like we're already looking at, we're doing this initial look at technical, managerial, financial capacity through the needs analysis, right? So I think there are questions about, well, how are we going to define that? And I think it was Camille wanting to kind of look in more detail at like how are we doing that? So I think that's something that will evolve over time. I don't think we have the answers now to that, but certainly one of the things we're going to look at as we're providing funding is doing that kind of TMF capacity analysis and not just identifying, well, what capital project do you need, but are there managerial or financial capacity deficiencies that need to be addressed as well. I think Jessica wants to move on to somebody else.
Just one final, just there's got to be some flexible things that they're going to be coming up on each community, because on the human right to water, it says that it needs to be affordable, and if the state can provide the resources to make it affordable, that's where we need the help of the state.
Right. Yep.
So just one thing to kind of frame it now with this conversation, because we have limited time, we want to make sure that that your comments and questions are related to the specifics in the policy if possible. So I know there's lots of questions still about how the project's going to look, but based on what we've heard and everything still kind of being developed, if you could try to formulate the question specific to the policy for this, and then we'll make sure there's opportunities to talk about the other things as we go forward too.
Yeah, so Jessica, and also I would say, if you have a recommendation,
Yes.
so like, I introduced this is kind of a blank slate. So people can ask me questions and I can give an opinion of what I think, but really as the advisory group, it's like, go ahead and advise us on what you think we should have in the policy, because there's not a whole bunch there right now. I admit that, besides statutory requirements and our initial ideas on prioritization. So if you have an idea of what needs to be in there, or if we should prioritize differently or that sort of thing, have at it.
Lucy Hernandez from West Goshen. Now that you said a recommendation, I'm going to call this a recommendation. I've been a member of Agua Coalition for more than a decade, and I've been very active. And I represent more than 20 communities in the Central Valley with the Agua Coalition. And I would like to represent Istorosi in this meeting right now, because I know Istorosi has been struggling with unsafe drinking water for almost 15 years. And I know there is funding available right now for this project to connect them to Orosi. And I understand that the only thing that is holding the project is because Orosi hasn't decided to step up and be a good neighbor with Istorosi. So I would like to know, what can we do to collaborate to make sure that Orosi does the right thing and help the neighbors? as the human safety for drinking water, because this is it's something that should have been addressed a long time ago. And now that we have this project going on, I think that right now is the time to have these communities prioritized, like SWRCB, Yeram, Seville, and I'm here because I'm representing these communities, and I think that it's time for us to do the right thing. And if we could collaborate with something, let us know how we could help you guys as the State Water Board. Let us know how we could help you guys to make sure that these communities have safe drinking water as soon as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I know, as Lucy said, that's been an ongoing issue. So I think it's a combination of using our regulatory authorities as well as making sure the financial assistance is available. So if there's something, we have had in our drinking water state revolving fund intended use plan, we've had some incentives for the larger entities to consolidate. I don't know that that incentive has been enough. So if as a sort of a policy matter, if you have a recommendation on knowing the situations like Orosi and East Orosi exist elsewhere, is there something else we can do to incentivize those larger systems to consolidate without going through, a long regulatory process? So I'd suggest that when you're providing comments, it doesn't have to be here, but in writing, that you think about how can we do that as a matter of policy, right?
One more thing. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I would also like to say that I know that Community Water Center has been very active working with those communities, and they do have a lot of information that it could be useful for you guys as well. And I would also like to mention about the next meetings that we're gonna be having in the future. If you guys might consider, maybe if you guys think it might happen, to have the meetings on Sundays instead of Mondays or during the week, so that way more.
We're going to talk about that.
Okay.
I promise we have time to
Okay.
talk about that.
Okay,
So-
okay, no problem.
Yeah, so
But
we-
I also wanted to
agree,
mention that Community Water Center could also help with the well testing and the private well owners, because I know that's what they do.
Thank you.
All right. You talked about some budget that you had for the rest of this fiscal year, and I just kind of want to talk about that for a second. Are you going to try to push through some of the Prop 1 projects that are kind of in the queue to try to use some of this funding on some of those projects to get them off your books so that we can kick them out and get some of those, so for example, the consolidation, or if they need something to get it be operational, is that the goal?
Yeah, so we have a number of those projects that maybe we're getting Prop 1 or Prop 68 funding, and we're switching out the funding source.
So if somebody's already working with you guys, you're going to try to streamline that process, get some of this $40 million spent on some of those projects to get some of those kind of taken care of. I think I kind of addresses some of the questions that have been happening here. Is that the goal with this?
Well, so
new
part of
budget?
it is when we switch the funding out to encumber these particular funds, it frees up the other money to be used for other capital projects that are in the queue that maybe aren't ready to go right now. So what we're hoping to do is move more projects forward faster, whether it's being funded with this fiscal year 1920 allocation or funded with the other funds that we have available.
Got it. And then I have one more question.
Mhm.
You had stated that you're not really taking new applications for the money that you're putting out this year.
Yeah.
But if you have agreements with other TAs, they're able to apply for additional funding. For example, the well program. I know we work with a TA a lot, and they have an application in to do a well assistance program in our area. And is that something that we can push through to do more of those types of projects through them, where it's an easier application process because you already have the agreements with them in place? And so I can have them reach out to you guys directly and say, hey, these people want more money, and then we can work with it that way. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, because it'll help them if they, when they're talking to us, they need to be able to tell us kind of scope and budget.
Sure.
So since they're working with you all, you can give them some sense of, hey, we think, there are X number of other, domestic wells that we'd like to work on in our area, and this is what we think the rough budget would be.
Excellent.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm going to go slightly out of order because there's some folks who haven't had a chance to comment today. So Benjamin, do you want to go ahead?
I'm Benjamin. I'm from Tuleville. I don't know, I'm probably out of line with my thing, but I know our community has been trying since 2001. Actually, everything, our nitrates exceeded since 1997. And all our wells exceeded MCL since 2004. I know Exeter was given or offered some money to connect us, but they just decided not to. How or what would our next step be to consolidate?
Yeah. So, and I'm trying to remember now, Tuleville, you're getting clean water. Is that right? Okay. Okay. Has hexchrome, but not not nitrate, right? So we don't. It's not over the MCL. Okay. So, and somebody from DDW or probably Laurel knows better. I believe the Consolidation Authority kicks in when there's a MCL violation, right? The ability to force a consolidation. So if my understanding is correct, then we would need to, absent their voluntarily coming forward, we would need to have some change in the statutory authority. Go ahead. Right. Right. Yeah. So but still, yeah, they can. So you can petition. So part of the policy outlines a petition process for the community for consolidation, and so that's on page 17. Still, the only way we could do it is if, it falls within the parameters of what our statutory authority is. Now, certainly as we're going out into, and talking with our district engineers and having discussions, this is certainly an issue that needs to be examined more closely, right? Where it's like there are a lot of systems that are going to be, I think, defined as at risk. They're not necessarily exceeding MCLs now at this moment, but like I think I visited you all a number of months ago and we talked about this. It's like at some point, you're going to be tired and not want to manage this little water system. So then what do you do? There's almost a perverse kind of incentive for you to start delivering bad drinking water so that then we can use our consolidation authority. But no, that's not the solution, is it? So so I do think that's something that needs to be explored in terms of, for now, I think all we have is on the incentive side to think about what other incentives might we provide to communities like Exeter, because I don't think we have the regulatory mandates that would apply in this case. And did I get that wrong? Any attorney or somebody from DDW? Okay. You need a mic.
Hi, I'm David Rice. I'm one of the State Water Board attorneys, and I work with the Division of Drinking Water. And the only thing I would add is that I think that we may have a little bit more regulatory flexibility in terms of when we can seek a consolidation. I don't think it's triggered by having an MCL violation, but as long as there's not a consistent supply of safe drinking water being supplied, then I think we can seek consolidation. So there may be some more flexibility there.
And we've definitely noted that, so we can make sure to follow up. Okay. Everett?
Yeah, I'm Everett with 4 Acres. Just to have thought recommendation maybe. I've heard a lot about different things you got up here and the technical assistance. I didn't hear anything about education. Is there anything in there to teach young people or different people to get some of these certificates they need so they can really be a help?
Yeah. So one of the things that Laurel and Andrew and others are working on is the workforce development aspect of all this, which, will likely include things like providing training that operators need. I think Andrew might have mentioned, we're starting to have discussions with like the CSU Office of Water Programs, who provides a lot of the training material now for operators, along with some of the community colleges, to find a way to support development of the local workforce.
Hi, Michael Claiborne, the Leadership Council. I guess I'd start with a boring process question, although kind of critical. For advisory group members, I know we're going to have another advisory group meeting in February to, I assume, be able to discuss this policy again after public comments come in. Second part of that question is, do you anticipate written comments from advisory group members, or anyway?
Yeah, written comments are always great because, we do our best, I think, to capture verbal comments, but may not catch all the nuance of what you're saying. So yeah, I'd encourage advisory group members and others listening to provide written comments.
Great. And then I guess I'll highlight my favorite part of the draft policy. I don't know if everybody has a favorite part of the policy, but I do.
That should have been the icebreaker.
Right.
What's your favorite part?
Page 3, the primary purpose of the Safer Drinking Water Program is to help to bring about true environmental justice to California and help to address the continuing disproportionate environmental burdens in the state by creating a fund to provide safe drinking water for every Californian. So I think that was a great inclusion in here. It mirrors the statutory language, and it's also a recognition of what studies have shown over the last couple decades, which is that small communities of color in the state are disproportionately impacted by drinking water contamination and unsafe drinking water. So I think that just highlights the need to make sure we're prioritizing low-income, disadvantaged communities of color in everything we do around this program, and also to make sure that solutions are community-driven. So identifying solutions, prioritizing when funding happens. I think this advisory group is part of that, but also with specific projects, making sure that the community is driving the solution. And I think that was more of a comment than a question. And then I have several comments here. Let me see if I can narrow it down to just a few. Long-term planning is something I mentioned earlier. It may be in the policy a bit, although I didn't see it highlighted as much as it maybe could be. I'd like to see something like a 5-year plan as part of the expenditure plan, looking out past this one annual expenditure and looking toward the future. So we're making sure that we're thinking about things proactively. And then affordability was already talked about a little bit. There is this definition of affordability threshold. I'd like more clarity around what that means, what the intent is behind looking at an affordability threshold, and whether that's going to capture communities that have already addressed a problem and now have on rates that people can't afford.
So do you have, when you submit your comments, will you have recommendations on what that should look like?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great.
Oh yeah, and then consolidation incentives. There is a mention of for refinancing existing debt, which I think is a good inclusion. Wondering if there's other things that at the staff level y'all are thinking about to actually incentivize consolidations. I know the $10 million interest-free loan, even though it's out there, hasn't really been used or taken advantage of. So just wanted to think that through. I think refinancing existing debt is good. Maybe looking at grants, although I worry a little bit about spending this money on grants to systems that should just voluntarily consolidate. But, and then I think that's it for now, except point of use, point of entry isn't called out as a potential solution on, I think, page 14. I think it's in here a few times. It's just not in that specific spot. Just wanted to make sure that's a goal.
Okay. Thanks.
Let me just speak to affordability threshold really quickly since you brought it up. And I know Horacio sort of touched on affordability too. Hi, everyone. I'm Max Gomberg. I do lots of different things for the board. So just a couple things on affordability threshold. The statute does require that in this fund expenditure plan, the board set an affordability threshold. And so at the next advisory group meeting, we'll have a presentation on options for doing that. I think one thing I just want to tee up for people to think about is the board could set an affordability threshold in a number of different ways. The question then becomes, and then what? And so for the purpose of thinking about this fund, I think sort of the core question is, if we set in a threshold and there are communities where people are, we've therefore deemed water unaffordable, are we going to use some of the money in this fund to subsidize rates? For how long? To what extent? So I just want to tee up that thinking now, but like I said, we will have a presentation on sort of the concept of the affordability threshold and how it fits in here for the next meeting.
Hi, Katie Porter with California Urban Water Agencies. So I really appreciated, Joe, hearing your comments on looking at long-term sustainability when you're thinking about how to prioritize where the funding goes, and also your comments on streamlining the process for applications and how these are considered. I also appreciated hearing that you're thinking about parallel efforts instead of having everything being sequential as a way to get to some of the streamlining, as well as Michelle talking about proactively approaching systems that you've already identified needing help. So this goes to that process piece of it. My understanding is that currently, when you're talking about timelines for responsiveness, you're starting that timeline with when a complete application is submitted and then thinking through how long the state board has to respond. I'd like to encourage thinking along the lines of, I think, piggybacking on what Sergio said about how long it takes to get some of that funding. If there are other tracking mechanisms you could be looking at in addition to how long it takes to turn it around, so that you can better understand where some of these projects might benefit from more assistance. It could be that maybe there's more education needed. It could be that maybe there's more clarification needed from the state board about what it is you're looking for to make a complete application. And I think there are opportunities for TA providers or other utilities to help in a collegial manner get the information to these systems so that they can have a completed application that would then be eligible for funding. So I just think there's a lot of opportunities there to gather the information you need to better target where you could streamline the process even further.
Yeah, I agree. And it's something we have the capability of doing because we actually have a database that tracks a whole lot of stuff. But so part of it is on us to make sure we're keeping that up to date, and then reviewing that information. So like you said, if something, like for example, those of you who have applied for funding from us know that we have these 4 packages essentially, like there's a general description, there's technical requirements, and then environmental and financial. And so part of it is, I agree with you, reviewing that and seeing like when we're getting stuck, what else can we do? So actually, I mentioned to you this kind of triage we did with the Division of Drinking Water. We're going to do sort of the same internal, kind of go internal process, like go through within the Division of Financial Assistance, review where we are with all of the projects in the queue, and identify, are there some critical next steps that we need to take to move stuck projects along, and that could be, talking to our TA providers, asking them to help out, or it could be, talking to the, Division of Drinking Water, asking them to help out with a letter of encouragement or whatever is needed. Sure.
Jesse Snyder, Self-Help Enterprises. I agree with everything Katie just said. Lots of good observations in there. In terms of other recommendations on the policy document, I think someone else mentioned this, but I would like to see private well communities and private well users called out a little more specifically throughout the plan. One of the things that is a game changer about SB 200 and SAFER is the fact that we can finally provide some direct assistance to private well users who we historically have not been able to support, or at least not very well. So I think there's lots of places in the document, and we'll make some written comments that those could be highlighted. Similarly, well, in some ways, emergency projects aren't really specifically called out as eligible solutions, and they're kind of referenced, but maybe not clearly stated. So I'd really like to see that stated specifically. Another thing that has been mentioned, so I won't dwell on it, but we really do need to come up with some other ways to incentivize consolidations. So I'd like to see that explored a little further in the policy. I have some questions about the petition process, one of which was, where did that come from? And Joe, you already told us you don't know where that came from, but it's really interesting to find this petition process in the policy, and I'd like to learn more about that. And maybe we can flesh that out a little bit too. You know, there's some terms in there like significant. Well, what does significant community support mean? Maybe we want to put a number on that, and maybe we don't, but it'd be an interesting thing to discuss. I'd also like to have something included in there about funding. If a community specific or successfully petitions for consolidation, you know, what's the state board's obligation or responsibility to support that financially? And my final comment is just kind of about the committee itself. This is a really terrific group of people. I've you know, seen lots and lots of committees in my time, and there have not been very many that had so much good representation from small communities and residents who actually live in those communities and run the water systems in those communities. And I would love to see us take advantage of this opportunity by really empowering this committee to make some decisions. I know I've heard it said we're not going to be voting or trying to come to consensus on any recommendations, and I guess I question that a little bit, and I'm a little curious why that is, because I think there could be a lot of power here to make some really fantastic recommendations that I'd like to see the board you know, really have to vet thoroughly and consider publicly. But this is off to a really great start, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be part of it.
Thank you. I have so much stuff, so I'm going to try to keep it more contained. So I think just as a big picture item, it would be very helpful if this plan had really measurable goals, perhaps on a 5-year horizon or a 10-year horizon for what we're trying to accomplish. And then ideally the policy and the fund will then reach those goals. Right now we've just recited kind of what's in the statutory language, and that was left fairly broad on purpose, but I think we can't address, for example, environmental justice when there's nothing in the policy that prioritizes funding for communities that are communities of color or communities with historic exclusion from access to like funding and capital, for example, which tended to happen primarily on racial lines in California. And so I understand that we have some limits in terms of how we address racial inequality in the state as a result of Proposition 209, but I do think that we also have a lot of proxies that are more effective than simply looking at whether or not someone has an immediate health risk or is a DAC. I think those things tend to go together, but they don't always go together. And there's certain regions that have a history of local agency animus that's very different, and some regions that have a long history of cooperation and have done much better as a result. And so I think it could be helpful for the policy to begin to get kind of specific on that. And ideally then we can match, you know, we set out our purpose, we drill down on what our objectives are under that purpose, and then we set up a process and a plan that reaches those objectives. And I think that's the promise of the policy document. In terms of prioritization of solutions for systems in violation, I'd really like us to look at vulnerability, and to define that, we could either borrow the definition from the EJ screen, or we could borrow something else, but I think social vulnerability is a really important aspect of this, whether that means lack of money because of persistent unemployment, or whether that has to do with other environmental justice hazards that a community faces and has multiple burdens of. But I think we need to, immediate health risk I think is not adequate actually under the plan. I think it's good, it's great, but it's not enough. the other thing I think would be really helpful is the length of the violation or the length of time a community has waited. So I know we talked about prioritizing prior or projects with prior histories or past compliance problems, but there are some groups that have been out of compliance for over 10, 20, 30 years, and we know who they are already, and I think we could probably address those much quicker than they've been addressed so far. I agree with what Katie was saying and Jesse as well about evaluating what happens before a proposal comes in. In my experience, DFA will hold an application and will not submit it until it meets what they anticipate will be the hurdles further down the line from other divisions. And I think it would also be helpful for us to know to what extent is that a staffing issue in terms of not having enough resources, and to what extent is it an issue of form over substance. I've certainly worked with communities where they're asked to provide certain forms that are very irrelevant for consideration of their project and are not actually helpful to DFA or to any other division. And so I think it's one of those things where people are required to provide something in a certain form, so they feel like they have to do it that way, whether or not that makes sense for the system. My other category of comments, and I'll try to keep them very, very brief, is around measurable metrics. So not just the outcome and output metrics that we talked about in processing applications, but also in terms of the achievement of how things go back into compliance, how long did they stay in compliance, what do we look at as health measures. I think there has to be follow-up if we're going to give out money, especially when we're concerned about sustainability. So I think that would be great to put in the policy document, and then of course we can revisit it if it doesn't work. I would encourage us to think about the plan and the policy as a long-term document that's revisited annually. And so that way we meet the statutory requirement of annual review, but we can think more dynamically about a long-term kind of stream. And I think it's really important for us to also consider language access and the public engagement process. So these are very quick turnarounds, and I think the advisory group is helpful, but I don't think we're a substitute for a robust public engagement process, and it's difficult to do workshops or other forms of public engagement with a 1-month comment window. But I'm very, very concerned with language access. So far, some of these documents are available in Spanish. The website is very difficult to access. It took me forever to get a copy of the policy, and I'm on Lyris, and I'm an attorney, and I should be able to use the internet, and I couldn't find it. So like it just took a really long time, and I feel like if someone like me can't do it, then certainly someone with limited internet access or who is in a rural area without a computer is going to have a hard time. And I think we really need to think about language access beyond Spanish. I know that the board has made a big push to try to do Spanish language documents, but I don't think that actually satisfies the board's obligation or this group's obligation under the Demali Aleatory Bilingual Services Act. It has a much more aggressive threshold for language access. So I think we need to also think about where are these systems located, where are the most vulnerable communities. Most of them are language excluded enclaves. What are the languages they speak? It's not always Spanish, it's sometimes Lao or Hmong or Mixtec. So I think it would be really helpful if we incorporate data we already have from OEHA and from other sources like the Secretary of State who tracks language access groups for polling, and use that to help develop a more inclusive public engagement process. But I want to commend the staff on everything they've done so far. I think this has been excellent and very different, and it's very bold and exciting. So I don't want my comments to be seen as like, you're not doing enough, but I think we could do more, and I'm looking forward to working together to doing that more.
Thank you. Thank you. I just have a couple of quick points. My name is Dawn White. I'm with Golden State Water Company, and there is a point under the eligibility where it states that an investor-owned utility that I work for, any funding can't benefit shareholders, and I just want to assure everybody that that is already the case. Our investors or shareholders only earn a rate of return on money they invest. So any funding that a company like mine would get only benefits the customers and has no benefit at all to our shareholders. Although we appreciate the ability to access that because it does allow us to participate in consolidation projects and other projects and maintain lower rates as a result. My second point is I'm seeing in here about individual groundwater wells, and all that's really important. And I know this is there are many fewer of these, but there are surface water users that are individual as well. And so I wonder
if the language can be open to just individual users. Just a thought there. I don't think there is many, but I am aware of some. And every other comment that has come into my mind, I think, has already been voiced by somebody else. So I appreciate all of that.
We will star them and appreciate your brevity. Okay. Sergio.
Thank you. Sergio with Pueblo Unido. So one of the things that I want to just to emphasize this, that is probably resonating a lot, is that we have all the allocation of funding in certain way how we're going to achieve this, but I think there is also room for strategies. How are we going to actually make sure that this is being achieved in a certain period of time? So I believe there should be certain policies that describe and outline strategies of it, like we're going to deploy this amount of funding by potentially reducing 30% of the application process, something like that. That definitely can be something to take in mind. It will give definitely a good scope and a measuring point about how the efficiency of the process is being taking place. Also, I really want to emphasize, as one of my colleagues have said, we need to definitely include a more deeper definition about emergencies. So I know that we have replacement water, which include bottled waters, vended water, point of use, and all this stuff. But we really need to have a deployment of these units in those emergencies. In my opinion, if anybody is exceeding the MLC, those are emergencies. Simple as that. We have emergencies. So think about this. All of us, we're going to go home right now with the satisfaction that we have drinking water. But I only can stop thinking about those families that have to deal with that every single day, 24/7, that they're struggling with that. So we should definitely have an emphasis of what else can we do to deploy resources for those emergency cases. So I would like to see something. I would like to really make the recommendation to include and to emphasize more deeply about a provision that discloses the resolution to deploy funding through emergency circumstances.
Just the Michael Claiborne again. I think Sergio just made a really good point about emergencies, and it almost seems to me that emergencies should be kind of outside of the normal priority setting. It's just, if there is an emergency, it should be funded. And then there was a comment that I missed from earlier. A couple of people have mentioned sustainability and wanting to fund sustainable water systems, which makes a lot of sense, and I definitely agree with that as a general principle. And there's a lot we can do there, like consolidating water systems. I do think, though, that we should recognize that there are some cases that there just doesn't seem to be a long-term sustainable solution for that doesn't include long-term O&M support. So situations like, I know I've already mentioned Cantua Creek a couple times, but it highlights a couple of these policy issues pretty well. They're not near any water system where you could consolidate. They've tried a lot of different solutions. They switched to surface water for a while, ended up having water quality and affordability problems through that, switching back to groundwater, but have hit either MCL violation from all their test wells or manganese, which again is going to require treatment. Small, low-income communities with very few connections. So I don't see a great solution there that doesn't include O&M support. So just need to, I think, acknowledge that.
All right. Do any of the advisory group members have any other comments? If not, oh, okay.
De nuevo, Isabel Solorio from Lanier. Mi recomendación es que esta agua sea de verdad asequible, que quiere decir económica, accesible para nuestras comunidades, que sea una solución buena y de largo plazo. Somos comunidades desfavorecidas desfavorecidas es de bajos ingresos, gente que trabaja en los files que gana el mínimo. So hay que pensar en eso. Yo vengo de familia del campo. Mi padre ganaba el salario mínimo. Ustedes saben qué se hace con el salario mínimo. So hay que pensar bien cuando se tome unas decisiones en las cuales se están buscando soluciones que ayuden a personas en esta situación. Gracias.
Isabel Solorio from Lanier. Her recommendation is that water is provided that is truly affordable, economical, and accessible for all communities, and that it truly is a good and long-term solution. She comes from a disadvantaged community, low-income community, working people that make minimum wage, and she's from a farm-working family, so everyone here knows how far minimum wage can get you, not very far. So, and when creating these policies and helping these communities, you need to find solutions. You need to help communities find solutions that find themselves in these tough economical situations.
Good afternoon, Emily Rooney with Ag Council. I would just like to echo the comments made earlier about providing measurable goals in this document so we can expect sort of outcomes and how much of the crisis are we trying to solve and by what timeframes. And I would even go as so far to beef up the section on metrics on page 16 to add specific timeframes on the number of communities and when we think those goals can be achieved, just to keep us very clearly focused on trying to solve the crisis at hand. And then just one question for the next meeting. I know there's going to be a conversation on affordability. To the extent you can get us advanced materials as soon as possible so I'm a little slow, so sometimes it takes time for me to digest things. I'd appreciate it. So thank you.
So I'll be really quick. I think earlier I was maybe asking more questions, and afterwards you said just give us your recommendation. So I just want to give my recommendation, I think, which was if it's not the case that technical assistance can be made available for planning purposes for public agencies, my recommendation would be that gets opened up for that. For a lot of different reasons, but I won't take the time, but I think it's great that we're able to provide written comment. And I think, at least from our side, we probably will provide a lot of written comment as to the reason why that should be the case. That's it.
Brain fart there for a second. I want to address the comments that I think Michael made and Isabel. There are going to be these systems that are out of the way systems that are going to be an O&M nightmare, and putting them into this fund is definitely something we need to do. But how do we make sure that those systems don't bleed this fund dry? And I know there's been some legislation and some talk about having state administrators to come in and be regional administrators over certain areas, and then bringing in a state operator or somebody who would be with one of the TA providers that could be an operator for these systems and then could operate them at a lower O&M cost. Somebody who is experienced, understands the TMF needs, understands the operational costs. So I guess our recommendation is to make sure that when we find these systems that there is no consolidation possible, and I totally understand that, we got to put into place something so that we're not bleeding this fund over and over and over and over again. It's just O&M cost every year, and it just goes up because obviously the longer we do this, the worse it's going to get for these systems.
Thank you. Okay, so it looks like we have a couple of public comments. All right, well, I'm going to take you in the reverse order that you went last time. So, Jonathan, do you want to come up first? We're running around.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to talk pretty fast here, so bear with me. Jonathan Nelson with the Community Water Center. And rather than give comments, would like to reframe them into suggested recommendations related to the fund expenditure plan. We do have Community Water Center many recommendations, and we will be providing written comments in partnership with multiple other NGOs, but wanted to share a few of the recommendations right now because we'd like to see discussion on these either at the next meeting or ideally to be included in the draft fund expenditure plan outline, which it sounds like we'll be talking about next week. So first, we would recommend the fund expenditure plan include specific goals, including a 5 and 10-year goal. We'd recommend these goals be ambitious, which shouldn't be hard to do given the nature of what we're talking about, and that they tie into the ultimate goal and the vision of the Drinking Water Fund, which is to make sure that every Californian in the state can have access to safe and affordable water. And we would like a roadmap to be developed by the board to meet those goals. I need a third hand to do this. Second, we would like to recommend the fund expenditure plan include a specific and meaningful focus on domestic well communities and state smalls as part of fund implementation, and that we also create specific metrics to assess how well we're meeting those needs. We will be providing some recommendations on that. Third, we would like to recommend the fund expenditure plan include a discussion on how to assist with systems that right now are impacted by unsafe water, but that may not have an MCL, Chrome 6 being one obvious example. We'd appreciate better understanding of how the board plans to address systems that do not have safe water, but that are impacted by contaminant that does not have an MCL. Fourth, we'd like to recommend the fund expenditure plan include a discussion on how to address the challenges of providing safe water to areas of the state where there may be mixed income communities or where we may have households with large numbers of people living within them, and so skew efforts to understand need based on commonly used metrics like MHI. We know that's a challenge, but we'd like to at least see discussion of that as part of the fund expenditure plan. Fifth, we'd like to recommend the fund expenditure plan include a discussion on how addressing drought and water shortage resiliency can be an element of meeting the climate change resiliency requirement. Almost done here. Sixth, we would like to recommend the fund expenditure plan include a new metric around public and community engagement so that we're assessing how well impacted communities are participating in what we're trying to develop here with the fund expenditure plan as an obvious example. And so that could be as simple as how many members from impacted communities attended a meeting or workshop to develop the fund expenditure plan. Seventh, we'd like to recommend the fund expenditure plan include some explicit emphasis or recognition around opportunities for local workforce development, and we would like to see metrics to track that, and we'll have some recommendations provided in writing. And then lastly, we'd like to see more emphasis just, and this is more broadly for the purposes of this work group, more discussion on that's less specific to a document and broader about how we're engaging with the public. I think you have like such incredible expertise on this committee. And no one knows how to engage with communities better than community members themselves. So to think about, how are we creating strategies to take what's happening here beyond these four walls and to engage with communities directly. Thank you.
All right, Jennifer.
Thank you, Jennifer Clary. I have a ton of comments, but I'm not going to tell you any of them. I'll put them in writing so you can read them. It's probably longer. The only thing I want to do is I want to support what Horacio was talking about because I don't think, Joe, you understood what he was saying. And that is it's common when you bring a system back into compliance that the water board requires that you have a capital reserve. And that capital reserve can be up to 2 years of your rates. I mean, it can be really high. And in this case, that's what, about 6 to 9 months of rates. So it's a really high reserve. And just to compare that, I live in San Francisco where they are required to keep a capital reserve to meet their bond requirements. It's a 3-month capital reserve. And their only reason is, of course, is you don't have credit when you're a small system. So my suggestion, and it always has been, I just don't have the understanding to get it started, is that the board creates some kind of capital reserve revolving fund, so the communities, instead of paying $20 a month for 5 years to bring their capital reserve up, money that they can't use, that you create a fund that community members can access by paying into it. And it doesn't, and that way it could be $1 a month per person instead of what it is now. And that addresses affordability. And I also want to repeat what everyone else said. And I'm sure you didn't mean what you said, Joe. What I heard you say was that we can't, because we can't fund O&M forever, so we won't fund it at all oh, good. That's fantastic.
Now,
I'm done then. Go ahead and answer.
Yeah. So what I was commenting on is that this funding, although it's a lot, it's $130 million a year for 10 years, has an expiration date. So to the extent we're funding O&M, it should, as best we can, it should be as a bridge to getting to sustainability, where the community can fund their own O&M over the long term. Because otherwise, we're just putting a Band-Aid on things for 10 years, 12 years, or whatever it is. So I think, and again, going back to what Jonathan said, and maybe over time we can do this as a group, is talk about some of these bigger policy issues and considerations. Right now we're like jamming to get these things done that we have to get done in order to get money out the door. If we don't have the policy and if we don't have the fund expenditure plan, we can't use any of the money. But there are a number of these topics that I think are worth a further discussion and kind of thinking about, like, what do we mean by sustainable, or and how does that fit in with affordable, and what's the role of the community versus what do we envision as the long-term role of the state with those issues. So because I think, and this is just kind of my observation and going into a number of the communities, whether it's down in Coachella or the Central Valley or whatever, is that I think what we want to do is we want to get to the point where these systems, through consolidation or whatever it might be, can stand on their own 2 feet, where you help out as much as we can, like especially when we're dealing with contamination, provide the funding for those capital projects, but some of the normal costs associated with operating a water system, to the extent we can, I think we want to get them to the point where they can sustain that themselves. Those communities can sustain that themselves. Because I'm not sure to what extent, looking 15 years in the future, are we going to have the funding available, to support things like operation and maintenance or other costs. And even now from, the discussion here, it's like, I think one of the advantages of our laying out, what the funding needs are and the gaps, or is then you can kind of go back to the legislature and talk about here. We've kind of defined what else is needed, which I think is super important. But part of me also here is like, oh my God, how are we going to ever meet these expectations? Because we have broadened the scope quite a bit in terms of what we can do. So where we need your help is we could always come back with proposals of, here's what we think, and then you can sort of throw darts at it. But what would be super helpful is when you hear from your advisory group members all of these different thoughts and ideas of how we should prioritize. What do you think we should do, given that we have a finite pie? It's bigger than it was before, but it's still finite. So how should we go about prioritizing from that kind of first the policy perspective, and then when we get down to kind of brass tacks of how much money should go to workforce development or how much money should go to smalls and domestic wells. So that would be super helpful to us.
Thank you, Tess Dunham. And actually, in a comment in large part similar to Jennifer Clary, I also had some concerns. I know, you're shocked, right? Little do you know how well we get along these days. On the O&M issue, I mean, there was a lot of incentive for many of us with respect to this funding was because of the O&M barrier, right? We all know that there's always been capital funding available, but the barrier to O&M was always a big issue. And one of my questions is what do we mean by long-term? You say, well, we don't want to get into long-term O&M. Well, is long-term 20 years? Is it 30 years? Is it 50 years? I mean, that's a pretty subjective term based upon some individual. So I think that, you know, and you use the term long-term several times within the policy and here today. And so I'd kind of like to have a better understanding in the board staff's mind what you consider kind of long-term so we can judge our written comments based upon that. And one of the other questions I have is there's also the new term in here that I hadn't seen before with respect to pure and wholesome water as compared to water with drinking water standards. What was the intent with the terminology of pure and wholesome? It's not something I've seen before in our drinking water regulations, and so I was curious as to what the intent was with respect to that. But really also just want to, you know, make sure that my comments mirror Jennifer's and that, you know, O&M is a big part of that because there isn't available other funds for that type of thing. And to not fund projects because they have an O&M with them, I think we're going to prevent and close out the types of systems many of us engaged in this process to help get funding for.
Right. So, you know, I'd like to also hear maybe from the public water systems when they're looking at their own rate setting, like how are they considering longer term? I mean, we look at, you know, kind of the useful life of the capital project, whatever that might be, and evaluate whether a system, especially when we're providing loan, can they operate and maintain that system, right? That's sort of the normal thing that we do. So that, you know, when I see the term long term, I think in terms of, I translate that into sustainable. So if, for example, if the state is to take some chunk of this funding and support O&M for I don't know how many systems, how long would that last before those funds weren't available anymore, right? And then what? So what, you know, I guess that's the sort of policy question I have is, like, to the extent that we do support O&M, how long can we do that before then the system is left to their own devices, right? Also understanding that there are these other calls being made. It's like if you're funding O&M, or to the extent you are, then what are you not funding out of the broad scope, you know, of what we have in front of us. And so, you know, again, going back to what I said earlier, I think where we need help is, you know, there's this huge scope that we have of projects that we can potentially fund, whether it's emergency, administrators, O&M, capital projects, et cetera. So when you're looking at that whole scope, I think where we need a lot of help is, where do you think the investment should be, right? I mean, that's where I think we can make some initial calls or guesses as where that should be, but I think where we need your help is, like, how should we be looking at that? Like, what percentage, for example, should go to O&M, or what percentage should go to interim replacement water or workforce development, that sort of thing. Jessica? More questions?
Okay, so I love it. The one last question. Give me let me see. Really, one last question. Who are comments, and then we're gonna do it. Okay, I'm gonna go to we have another member of the public that's gonna speak, and then I'll hit you two, and then we're gonna have to take a quick break.
Michael Warburton of the Public Trust Alliance, and once again, I'm confused because the State Water Board has more authority and flexibility than it seems to be letting on by not talking about its responsibility as a trustee of the California Public Trust. And rates, water rates, are public trust assets. And I think people have talked here about consolidation of systems as if they're just within the state of California or neighboring water systems. But at the same time, in terms of California assets, San Jose Water wanted to buy, what was it, Connecticut Public Services. and it was a more than $1 billion deal, and they didn't want to do a application to the California Public Utilities Commission because the Public Utilities Commission might actually have to evaluate the public interest. And it was actually an environmental organization in Connecticut which suggested the mechanisms by which it would not violate the public trust doctrine. And the executive director of Connecticut River Alliance didn't understand what the public trust doctrine was. And I think there's a, I don't know, you know, can the public be undefended? And I think the state board has taken steps to defend the public, but you know, as long as these sham transactions are occurring at $1 billion level nationally, this thing about shareholders not being the ones to benefit, that particular agreement had accelerated payments to shareholders in Connecticut, with California public trust assets. And I don't understand this avoidance of the public trust. Gavin Newsom's father was a appellate attorney, and he sent me a note when I was talking about the public trust with respect to development of military bases in California. He said, I share your apprehension over the erosion of public trust doctrine, but have had real trouble generating any confidence that as our political system continues to degenerate into a mere formula for enriching those rich enough to pay for further enrichment, there is any real hope. When an appellate judge of the state of California says something like that, you know that the public has been let down. And we have an amazing opportunity now. Actually, there's plenty of work for everybody who wants to do it, but there are programs within the water finance deal which are just plain stupid. And I'm talking about, for example, a utility wanting a desal plant where there are 3 public rivers coming and flowing into the sea. And the entire capacity of the desal plant is 1% of annual use of water in the county, 1%. And yet the water rates would increase several hundred percent to support this desal plant that isn't necessary. And I think water finance also has to look at, you know, okay, is this safe drinking water thing a very, very small program? What about the subsidy that's given every year to private businesses to operate Rube Goldberg systems, because they're compensated on the basis of return on capital investment rather than, you know, payment for affordable water. And anyway, I'm just suggesting that this advisory group and the state board take a look at who you are. And the public actually owns the water. And some of these people who are talking about these communities saying, we'd love to do this, but we don't own it. The public does own the water in California, and it'd be really useful if the financing institutions, you know, say, oh yeah, that's right, we're trustees. So.
Joe, just wanted to clarify what I think I heard you say, and maybe you can clarify me set me straight if I'm wrong. When you bring up the issue of whether we can fund O&M longer term past the term of this, the 10-year term of this, you're not suggesting that we shouldn't fund O&M now just because we don't have an answer in the future.
Right.
You're just saying we should look at, understand that we have to address that at some point before this fund runs out. Is that correct?
Yeah, what I was trying to get at is that to the extent we look at funding O&M, I think part of our policy or the expenditure plan should be with the thought of what happens when or if that support's not available. Not to say you don't do it for
But
some
it shouldn't
interim.
be a criteria that would forego or foreclose the ability to use this for O&M, because
Right.
I agree with Jennifer,
Right.
and
I
I
think
suspect Michael as well, that
yeah.
O&M's key to this whole fund.
Yeah,
and we
because
need
I
to-
think there's the reality that, in some cases, especially when we're looking at treatment, right? And that will, especially for some small communities, result in a huge cost, is that you couldn't go through the shock of, okay, your rates are whatever, $40 a month. Now they're going up to $120 immediately. So, may want to think about, well, how could we support that community during, for some period of time where there might need to be a transition from getting state support to a gradual increase in rates so they can, address their own O&M. Or the other thing is, to think about, and I think it was brought up before, like with Nick, in terms of thinking about more of a regional approach to managing systems, is in the interim, the O&M costs may be high because you don't have a regional authority type of thing set up, or the consolidation hasn't been done yet. So I'm just saying we want to, I think, collectively think through the circumstances of what are the criteria for supporting O&M, and do we have that expectation that will be ongoing and indefinite, or for some set period of time.
So
I don't
I'll
say
turn
I
this
have
to
any
a-
of the
to a
answers.
I'll turn this into a recommendation that I don't think that having some uncertainty about future funding should foreclose the ability to fund O&M now, because we will always have that uncertainty. The O&M is really the key to this fund, and we need to focus on that. And that uncertainty can't stop us from doing what we need to do now. And I think I'm talking for Michael ahead of time as far as what Tess did supporting what Jennifer's comments were.
Yeah, that's pretty accurate. So yeah, just on this O&M point, I agree it's a really, really important policy point that we all need to debate and come to an agreement on. In terms of how I'm looking at this, it's take every tool in the toolbox, try to fix the problem, and if the answer is we don't have a long-term solution for a specific problem outside of long-term and potentially indefinite O&M support, then that's where we should go. And I know we have 10 years of funding now. This is right now a time-limited program. I think strategically what we should be thinking about is in 10 years when we go back to the legislature and we say, okay, this funding is running out, here's what we did with it. We solved all these problems. We did everything we could to get every community a sustainable source of drinking water. And there are these communities that we couldn't find a sustainable solution for that didn't include additional state support. So we want additional state funding. And I think that's a pretty solid argument.
I hate to break this to everyone. We can come back and answer more questions, but we do need to take a break for at least 10 minutes, okay? So hold that thought, Horacio, and we'll start with you. All right, folks, if you could start making your way back, please. We're going to start our final session. Okay, so we're just going to wrap up the last set of comments with Horatio.
Just some comments on the operations and maintenance. Some of the water systems are being operated very expensive. I think if you have a water operator that charges you 56,000 and you have another one that charges you 20,000, so you will get the one with 20,000. If you use that 20,000 and you get other systems to be in collaboration with you, you can lower the rates. And that's how you will be building more affordable way of operating systems. So that's one way, and it can be expanded into the future. On the doctrine theme that the public was talking about, we know that in order to get solutions for these problems is that we have to mitigate the water contamination that is happening. If we don't mitigate the water contamination, we're going to be putting money where in a system that might get contaminated later. So we need to work on that also. So I think water belongs to everybody. It belongs to the public. It's just the industries are over-extracting water and they're over-contaminating. So it's very difficult to put that doctrine in place. Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to give an overall thank you to everyone who has been giving comments and to the advisory group members. And just as a reminder that this isn't a one-time conversation. This isn't the end of the conversation. This is really the beginning, right? So we're at the very beginning stages. So there's going to be lots of opportunities to continue to help develop this kind of dynamic program that we have going on now. So don't feel like this is it. Please, if you have comments to provide, as Joe mentioned, please provide them in writing, recommendations, and you can get very specific in those. It's very helpful for board staff if we have that specificity as well. So we're getting close to the end, so I'm going to turn it over to Andrew to go over some of the next steps.
Thank you, Jessica. So this actually should just take a couple minutes, but I just wanted to make sure, and we've talked about almost all of these things, but just to make sure as we're sort of departing that, or tying things up today, that we're all on the same page in terms of what's upcoming. So as we mentioned, the first sort of date-wise things that are coming, February 3rd, or when the public comments are due on the policy that we've been discussing today. So just so everybody's aware of that. We're working currently on the next advisory group meeting, which we're tentatively scheduling for mid-February, and we're planning on having that in Fresno. So as soon as we find as soon as we find a venue for it, then we'll be able to tell everybody when and where it is. And we realize we need to do that as quickly as we can. We want to give everybody as much lead time, of course, so that we're working on that. At that next meeting, there'll be several things on the agenda. The first is, of course, we can talk about the final fund policy draft. So if there's any more follow-up after the public comment, we can talk about that. We'll also have the outline for the draft expenditure plan. So we won't have the draft plan yet, but we'll have the outline so we can at least start to get those comments in a little earlier than we were able to for the policy. We're going to have a little more in-depth discussion of the needs assessment. So going into some of the draft deliverables that we are receiving, and so we can actually get into some more of the details on that than we were able to today. There are a couple other sort of things that we had talked about, like parking lot type items, that if we have time on that agenda, I would like to talk a little bit about sort of our data tracking and visualization, which we touched on today. It's just a matter of, I think we will have those visualizations ready to go by then. And if so, I'd like to share them with the group. So that's something that's potentially on there. It's certainly something we know we need to share with the group. It's just whether we'll have it by February, not 100% sure. And then the other thing, which I don't know if it'll be a discussion for next time, but certainly just reflecting on what was discussed here today, and just so we'll put this forward for one of the group's future meetings. Certainly is all the discussion of O&M, and we realize that that was one of the primary drivers that kind of got us SB 200 and got us the funding. And so we really do need to get into a discussion of what that's going to look like, or at least start that discussion. And so whether that's in February or that's at an upcoming meeting, I just wanted to flag that I think that is something that we do need to agendize and spend some time on what sort of the consensus of the group is around that, or what the different ideas are. One thing just to mention is, we talked about administrators, and part of what administrators would be doing is O&M. And so like there are things like that maybe, we just need to get a little better handle on, for example. But I think that's one that's going to be critical, and just again, we'll go back and reflect upon what was discussed today and figure out how and what best to discuss with that. So those are, again, some things that will definitely be on the agenda for February, and a few things that might be February or might be April, and we'll work, the staff will work and figure that out. Next, after the February meeting of this group on March 3rd is when we're planning the adoption meeting for the policy. So that would be a board meeting in Sacramento, where they will consider adopting the policy. We're planning on April 3rd to be the release date for the draft expenditure plan for the next fiscal year, and then following that, we would have an advisory group meeting in mid-April. And again, we will try to get that set as soon as we can. And that advisory group meeting will be somewhere in Southern California. So that's kind of the loose plan in terms of what the next two meetings of this group will be. On May 4th will be when comments will be due on the expenditure plan. So And then we're planning on June 16th, I think Joe mentioned, as the proposed adoption date for the expenditure plan. So again, that would be a board meeting in Sacramento. And then past that, we'll be working on figuring out the meetings of this group in the summer and the fall. There's going to be some meetings associated, public meetings associated with the high-risk mapping that we talked about, and we'll probably, when we have those meetings, we'll probably piggyback on those and also spend some time on other aspects of the needs assessment. So those will be upcoming. We're not quite sure, but during 2020. And I think that was all I had in terms of next steps, unless there was anything, Joe or Jessica, anybody
I
else
just
that I
have
forgot?
a few logistical types of things and some reminders too. So as Andrew mentioned, we are going to be having another meeting in mid-February. If the advisory group members have any specific dates that you're aware of that would not be good meeting dates, that would be helpful. If you could send those, you can email them to me. And then also, I know that Lucy mentioned looking at having them on a weekend. You said on a Sunday, and that would be something to also, we'll look at that and as a group try and come up with the date. The other thing is, in terms of locations, it's important that we can webcast these meetings so that the folks that can't actually make it can see them. But if you have suggestions on facilities, if you are from somewhere near Fresno and you have a suggestion for one, we're happy to take those also in the Southern California, other locations as well. So if you know of a space that you think would be a good space, please, we encourage you to send those along. It's helpful for us. Also, just to let you know, because there's been a lot of discussion on the confusion of the website and where to find materials and all of those different things. And so what we have a promise for you is we are working on getting a web page. It's going to be up by this Friday, and it will be where all of these meeting materials are posted. So we'll have the presentations will be available, all of the documents will be available, and then moving forward, that's where we'll make sure that we have everything posted and you'll have access to that. So we do apologize in advance. We had hoped to have everything more organized, but we've been working on a tight timeline. The other thing is we have an email subscription list specifically for the Safer Drinking Water Program. So if you want to receive notices and other information specifically related to this, you can go to the Water Board's website under the subscription tab at the very top of the page. We're under the general interests category and it says Safer Drinking Water. If that was confusing, you can always email me and I can direct you to it specifically as well. For those of you that are going to be dealing with any travel reimbursements, I'll be handling those directly with you. So if you have questions, we can handle that. You can talk to me today after this, call me, email, whatever we need to do, but I'll help be coordinating that with you. And then just to let you know, we are going to be sending out a follow-up survey just to get feedback from the advisory group, but also from the public on the meeting. And were there things that we weren't able to touch on that didn't get brought up? Are there procedural issues that you think would be helpful? I'm hearing that we need bigger PowerPoint presentation visuals so people can see. But those types of things are very helpful to let us know because we want to make this functional for everybody. And I do again want to appreciate you. I thought that everybody did a very good job to follow the ground rules, which I very much appreciate. Katie, do you have a question? You should automatically be on it if you are on the advisory group. Actually, you should be automatically on it if you applied to be on the advisory group. You should have already received an email through that of the public meeting notice, I believe, for this meeting. So if you did not receive that to your email, that means you're not on it for some reason, and we should check into that. And I know we already had one person that had an issue, so I want to connect to make sure that everybody is that. So we have sent one item out on that for that one. Are there any questions from the group on this? Oh no, you have to remember it all right now. No, absolutely. Yes. We will put them down and we will send them out to you. And actually, I think we do have another document that we'll be posting that's kind of an overview that includes all those already in it. But we will remind you and bombard you till you no longer want to see emails from me with that information. Any other questions? Okay, so yeah, absolutely. So Sergio? Yes, so we will send out a list of potential meeting dates, or at least little yeah, something that we can send out for you. Absolutely, we will do that. I did have one person who wanted to speak during the final public comment period. Is there anyone else who didn't submit a card that wants to speak again? No. Jennifer, are you here? Sorry, I can't see you. You wave? Oh, okay. Oh, just in case. Fair enough. Okay. Better safe than sorry. Okay, well then before we go, first of all, does anyone else do any more? Okay, then I'm gonna give Laurel an opportunity to kind of wrap it up for us.
Thank you all so much. I just want to say, as a member of the board, and I know speaking for the other board members, that this is a very top priority for each of us, all 5 of us. And so this feedback and engagement, not only at this meeting, but the follow-up from these meetings, whether it's formal written comments, future workshops and board meetings or group meetings, and also just now that you know staff and many of the other staff, and certainly me and other board members, it's invaluable. We need it to be successful as a state in accomplishing this goal, and we're really grateful for all the discussion and recommendations already. And really, I think what you're hearing from each of the staff and from this discussion is a request to provide as much concrete recommendations to help us figure this out, continue to evolve as we go, and also just a willingness to think creatively, try to improve, pull together every resource or tool we have. So with that, I just want to say thank you. Thank you to staff that have been facilitating this and all of the work putting this together. Thank you to each of the advisory board members and members of the public that traveled really far and woke up at the crack of, while it's still dark, to travel here today. It's a really long day, but each of your contributions has been so helpful, I know, to me and each of our staff, and I think to the state, and just really look forward to continuing the dialogue and continue to learn and continue to evolve this program together. So look forward to seeing you all again soon.
Thank you.